There's a reason flash storage isn't called electronic non-volatile memory storage. IBM Flash Storage is fast, cloud-ready, scalable and surprisingly affordable. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.
Hi, I'm Adam Shepherd.
And I'm Jane McCallion.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
Speaking of the most important topics in the IT industry, we've got an exciting event happening at the end of the month, ITPro Live.
That's right, ITPro Live is a virtual conference spread across 5 days, with each day focusing on a different theme. Speakers include John Topper, CEO of Scale Factory, and Alex Hilton, CEO of the Cloud Industry Forum, both of whom have previously guested on this very podcast, as well as representatives from Dale, RSA Security, Tech London Advocates, Puppet, and more.
I'm really looking forward to this. I mean, possibly, just to big myself up here, I am actually involved in the opening day doing one of the Q&As and later on in the week as well. And you're doing a couple of moderations, aren't you?
I am indeed. I'm going to be doing a panel on building a minimum viable product in the cloud, as well as a couple of Q&As throughout the week.
Yep, and we've also got a star turn from Maggie Holland, our editor-in-chief, Justin Cutler, who is editor of ITPro.com and has also guested on this podcast, and Dale Walker, our deputy editor.
So the conference is free to attend, and we have also radically streamlined and simplified the sign-up process, so it's easier than ever to get your ticket.
We will, of course, leave a link in the show notes to where you can sign up, and we hope to have you join us on week commencing the 22nd of June.
Later on in this week's episode, we'll be talking about the gender data gap with special guest Constanza Di Gennaro, COO of BioBeats. But first, let's talk about this week's top news stories.
So, first up, Google Cloud has signed a deal with the UK government, sort of. So, what's been signed is actually a Memorandum of Understanding, which is a deal that's not legally binding, but it's with the Crown Commercial Services and includes access to Google Cloud's managed and serverless offerings, including Anthos, which is their big play at the moment.
That's their big multi-cloud solution.
Yes.
So this is a further push from Google into the public sector. It's been doing a lot of work on that front in the US. It's got a massive contract with the Department of Defense, which it landed a couple of weeks ago. But this is one of the kind of first inroads it's made in any kind of major way with the UK government.
Yeah, I think this sector just kind of generally has been dominated by Amazon, so AWS, and also Microsoft to a quite big degree. A lot of the public sector will have a legacy relationship with Microsoft, and so it makes sense for them to use Microsoft Cloud. You see that a lot in other big business. But it's interesting, though, to see that Google is also trying to push hard into this territory.
I think it's particularly interesting because the UK has some fairly stringent compliance and procurement regulations in terms of working with public sector organisations. So getting that kind of deal underway in the UK puts Google on quite a good footing to start catching up with particularly Microsoft, which has a thriving public sector business, which is partly a legacy of its legacy, I suppose, because it has a lot of pre-existing relationships, but also because it's been around so long, it's been on the kind of procurement frameworks and has had all the kind of mechanisms that you need to deliver public sector contracts for a number of years. So Google is sort of on the back foot in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's listening who is involved with public sector or, kind of some cloud procurement will be familiar with G Cloud. And it did remind me of that initiative, which has constantly tried to push the idea of using cloud services into the public sector, and initially at least smaller UK cloud providers. That's been a constant kind of point of contention with people who are on the framework. So there's been a push for ages, but it's interesting to see somebody else come into the field, albeit Google.
It should also be noted that G-Cloud is, in fact, the government's own public sector cloud framework and not a Google product, confusingly.
Oh, yeah, actually, I'm so embedded in this area, it hadn't even occurred to me that could be a confusion. But yes.
That really tripped me up when I first started covering this area. I'd spent a good 6 months thinking that G-Cloud was a public sector Google product.
Oh, whoops. So speaking of things that we've all had to familiarise ourselves with over the past 6 months or so, Zoom has announced a huge revenue surge, but there are still big questions over security.
Zoom has announced a surge of 169% year-on-year revenue growth in the first quarter of 2020, which somewhat defeats the fears posed by some, including our own staff writer Kumar's Fifi Sabet, that the company's massive explosion in free users would be difficult to translate to actual financial growth.
It's nice of you to throw Kumar under the bus. It's been the problem. You see that problem in social media quite a lot. Trying to translate a huge number of users into actual revenue and money has been a big problem. Twitter, in particular, has suffered from this. So
has Slack, notably, in a similar vein. They've really struggled to convert companies to paying users.
Yeah, I mean, Zoom must have just somehow managed to do that, to get people off the free tier and onto the paying subscriptions of whatever level. Also, it was used in businesses before. I was familiar with it. I know some of my friends were familiar with it as well. But I don't know if it was as widely used as, say, Google Hangouts or Skype and those kind of competitors. So going from kind of 10 to 20 is 100% growth. So if you had a small base to start with, 169% year-on-year growth, what are the actual figures here? Yeah. So the CEO, Eric Yuan, has said that the growth is entirely due to COVID, the lockdown, the fact that we are all having to work remotely, which I'm sure will come as a surprise to nobody that that's kind of the instigator behind this growth. But he also said something else interesting to Bloomberg this week, which plays into the security fears that there have been around Zoom. But there are big security questions, one of which has been about end-to-end encryption, of course. And interestingly, it looks like only paying tiers are actually going to get that. He said earlier this week, free users, for sure, we don't want to give that, which is end-to-end encryption, because we also want to work together with the FBI, with local law enforcement, in case some people use Zoom for a bad purpose. So what do you make of that?
Well, this is something that has got a lot of, security and privacy campaigners up in arms, but it's also something that's very, very common in that a lot of fear-mongering, really, is done around the potential for encrypted services, encrypted messaging services, encrypted comms of various kinds to be used by terrorists, criminals, whatever is the current boogeyman du jour. And it's something that it's an argument that is often made but doesn't really hold any great degree of water, because even when access is given to communications services, there's always something else that is encrypted and untraceable. There's always another option for those kind of bad actors to hide their communications if they want to. So depriving the rest of the population of encryption isn't really a solution for that particular problem.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me think of when BBM, BlackBerry Messenger, was blamed for the spread of the 2011 riots that started in London and moved from borough to borough, and then they were in Manchester and stuff. And it's like, yeah, sure. I'm sure that people can't organise, just organically, and definitely in the 70s and 80s and 1800s and everything. That's not something that ever happened in the past. It's all about technology and encryption.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, famously, when the French citizenry were storming the Bastille, they organised all of that over, I think, Telegram and Zoom, I believe.
Yeah, possibly a spattering of WhatsApp as well.
Alex Stamos, previously CSO of Facebook and recently recruited to Zoom's team to help shore up their security and particularly their security image, has said that all Zoom members and users will continue to benefit from 256-bit encryption, but the end-to-end encryption is going to be rolled out on an opt-in basis for now, which is somewhat confusing messaging.
Yeah, I think very much so. It doesn't pair up at all with what Eric Yuan said.
And finally this week, the UK government has introduced new plans to protect UK tech firms from takeovers by foreign investors.
Yes, so this was hinted at in Prime Minister's questions last week, but the main reporting on this now comes from The Telegraph. We've got a bit more information on it. Apparently, it's primarily protection for startups and thought more specifically to target VC investment from China.
There are concerns that this could hamper growth for UK companies, though. It's no secret that China is the centre of an awful lot of tech development and particularly tech investment. Tencent are huge investors in global tech and global startups, as well as Alibaba and other kind of Chinese mega corporations.
Yeah, I was going to say Jack Ma. It's difficult, isn't it? It's possibly related to the panic about our dependence on Huawei for 5G infrastructure, which is something that government is apparently actively looking at. There might be a couple of potential deals to loosen that. But some in government they're concerned that it would hamper growth, which I think is a valid concern. It's a sticky issue.
For me, it reeks a little bit of protectionism, I guess, I think it's particularly notable that China has been singled out as, something that UK firms need protection from, when in fact, if you kind of look at the trends, a lot of the more detrimental strip mining of companies that goes on in the VC space, where investors will buy a company and just strip it for parts and sell those parts off to various other companies for parcels of cash. That much more frequently is US and European companies than it is China. China does invest for growth in the majority of cases, because they're still building that ecosystem to a large degree.
It could almost be seen as part of the Belt and Road strategy, which is all about investment and influence in countries. You see it more in Africa, really, but it is potentially infrastructure as well. But like you say, if it's long-term investment and the companies keep going here, then I'm not sure what the detriment to us is, really.
Also, not to put too fine a point on it, with Brexit looming, do we really want to be shutting down avenues for external investment into the UK right now?
Or maybe that's the point.
I mean, possibly. Who knows at this point? Well, on that cheery note, we're going to take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll be talking to Constanza Di Gennaro, COO of BioBeats, about the gender data gap.
See you after the break.
The IBM Flash storage solution can be broken down into 3 S's. Speed, retrieve data fast and efficiently. Scalability, grow your storage as your business grows. Simplicity, easily migrate and integrate with existing systems. Oh, and there's a 4th. It's surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price from as little as 1,300 kroner. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Visit ibm.biz/flash offer now.
Welcome back. The gender gap is often something that's thought of in terms of female representation in the STEM sector and in leadership roles. But as recent concerns over PPE in the health service have shown, with equipment sized to fit men rather than women, the problem is much broader than that. Here to talk with us about another aspect of this disparity, the gender data gap, is Connie Di Gennaro, COO of BioBeats, a health tech company. Connie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So, first off, I think by now we're all familiar with concepts such as the gender pay gap and gender disparity in general. But what is the gender data gap specifically?
Of course, well, the short answer is that the gender data gap is the lack of representation of females in data sets. So the data sets that are used for statistical purposes, decision making in business, or even machine learning. The concept is very easy to understand, but it's really difficult to correct because it renders a lot of the data sets that we already have as either incomplete or at times obsolete. So it's a really uncomfortable truth, particularly in medicine. But because it affects everyone, it's really important that we do address it.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned medicine, actually, because one of the things that I've picked up on during the current crisis is the problem with data that's being brought in from people who have COVID. It's not gender disaggregated, it's not race disaggregated. And so this is part of the reason why some of the effects, such as women being less likely to die of the infection, or people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds not being seen as being as a high risk group until really very recently, is, I think, quite a good recent example of that. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. We can stay on the topic of gender, but we also need to understand that any data gap, whether it's race or gender, it's a massive issue when it comes to drawing to conclusions basing yourself on data that's available. Disaggregating data is essential to actually address these issues.
So why is there such a disparity in data collection between genders and between different ethnic groups?
Well, there are many reasons as to why this doesn't happen. It's the same reason as to why sizes are limited when it comes to clothes. It would be amazing if one size did fit all, but it just doesn't. And there's just not a great motivation, to change that. There is, on the other hand, a bit of a motivation to getting close enough, and that's fine. This has always been dangerous, but it's becoming more so because all of the data gaps actually translate into silence. So rather than underrepresenting a particular gender, it tends to exacerbate the widespread idea that an average person is actually an average man. And when you're making decisions using statistics, which is already an approximation, it's a very useful approximation, but that's what it is. You can find yourself quite far away from the truth. And also the quality of the prediction will be defined by the quality of the data that is used. For example, you were mentioning PPE earlier, and there's a lot of issues around sizing. But the issue is also that size is a simple-ish variable. And when design is being considered, for average humans, that is average males, one tends to assume that a smaller size would fit a woman, but other characteristics are actually ignored. And that's also a data gap. It's not just lacking the data points, it's also lacking the relevant characteristics that would actually apply to other people.
So increasingly data is being fed into AI systems for analysis, as you alluded to. What is the risk when we get effectively sexist AI systems, if you like?
So many things to say about that. I know, first of all, I know why we call them, we call AI systems sexist. But I would really like to point out that it's not that a robot is left to its own devices and lands on a sexist conclusion. And I only say this because I've heard some ridiculous arguments justifying sexist statements as though AI systems are proof that these statements are actually objective. And that's not the case at all, as you probably know. Also, AI is a buzzword and we all love using it, but there are quite a few misconceptions around its current capabilities. Which is understandable because there's some incredible achievements around these systems, such as image recognition and diagnosis. So that's, again, back to medicine. But just like any system, it's only as good as its design. And the results are only as good as the quality of the data that goes in. one of the most repeated phrases around AI is rubbish in, rubbish out. And I believe that this can also translate to silence in, silence out. You know, if you're missing the page of a book, you're just not going to get the full story.
So what kind of impacts can we see from systems that are fed these incomplete and biased data sets?
So there's a lot of issues around AI and gender. So you might use Siri. I don't want to say her voice too loud just in case she detects it, but it struggles to actually recognize female voices, which I find really funny considering most voice assistants which run on AI have lovely female voices like Alexa, Siri or Cortana. I apologize to anyone listening who just triggered their AI. But, you know, to point out one specific issue, with AI increasingly becoming part of diagnosis and drug development, and, you know, in countries like the UK, where we have the glorious NHS, prevention can mean the difference between running a system smoothly or total collapse. So, you know, it might seem expensive to close the gender data gap, but you know, illnesses affecting women and misdiagnosis will and are already costing a lot more. So, yeah, if AI is the response to scale, the last thing we want to do is to scale bias.
And of course, there was the notable example late last year of Apple's Apple Card system giving wildly different credit limits to a husband and wife, despite the fact that they had, you know, joint accounts and very similar credit histories. The husband got a significantly larger credit limit than his wife did, and because Apple's algorithm for assessing, you know, credit risk and credit limits was a opaque black box system, it was very difficult for them to assess why that decision was made.
Yeah, don't get me started on that. I mean, do if you want to, but yes, it's everywhere. And you know, there's an excellent book, and if you are interested in gender data gap, you might have heard about this. And if you don't, you should read it just for curiosity. But it's called Invisible Women, and it's by Caroline Criado Perez. She articulates this issue comprehensively. But in my experience, just like most biases, we're not great at identifying if we are biased. So, you know, because a lot of it is quite subtle and hardly ever malicious. I'm quite an optimistic person, so I want to believe that it isn't. You know, but when we talk about how to identify bias, you know, I actually think it's more important to find out when. You know, because unchecked bias will be built into the system, exacerbating the problem. So it has to be done at the very beginning. In this case, it, you know, would have been literally on the drawing board.
So, you know, if this problem is at a drawing board level, how do we identify our own implicit biases? Because we all have them, and you know, it's just part of our psychology. So it's hard for us to identify that this is a problem when we're putting the data in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I find that the simplest way has to be to have the right people at the table when starting the process. I absolutely love how my generation has so many men who identify as feminists, but how that would translate to designing a good system is not only to ask women, but to have them design the system too. If you want to be cynical, think about the efficiency of skipping the step of reaching out to women altogether, you know, if they're already in the room. I know it's a really old story, but NASA engineers sent Sally Ride to space for just 1 week with 100 tampons, just to be safe. I know it's objectively funny, but it's such a great representation of how the gender data gap works. It just makes really clever people make terribly silly mistakes.
I see it quite often on Twitter, actually, when you come across these kind of data bias problems and something's gone horribly wrong. A lot of people will be like, hire anthropologists. Normally anthropologists are arguing for this.
Yeah,
but
it's very fair.
Sorry, anthropologists. But, you know, this idea of bringing in a different way of looking at things. So it's not even just software engineers, even female software engineers. It is just another angle of looking at this kind of stuff. Is that, Joe, a possible solution as well?
I completely agree. When it comes to data, one of the biggest ways to avoid what are called data traps is framing. And you can only have a really well done framing by having different people talk and ultimately scrutinize one another's opinions. That's the scientific process, and that's what was really good about it, is that it's in pursuit of the truth rather than having an agenda. Well, if done right, I suppose. There's so many great examples of bias, and some of them are funny, some of them are tragic, but I think that a great example in bias is, for example, wearable technology, which is my line of work. A lot of really useful systems have been designed to work with your phone in order to assess your health and activity levels. In fact, think about the apps that helped people track the symptoms of COVID. So this follows the assumption that people have their phones on them, usually in predictable places, call them pockets. Now, that isn't true for women all the time, because even if we do have pockets, they can be a joke. Sometimes they're just so small, like just inexistent. So I love talking about technology and wearable technology because it's creating new data sets. And that's what we actually need. We need to stop using the ones where we know that the gender data is lacking. But if women are not using these systems because they're not designed for them, then we're repeating the same mistakes and we're building enormous data sets with that huge bias yet again, even if the intention is good. So I know that there's a lot of mixed opinions around wearable technology. It's not for everyone, but that's one of the ways in which we are looking to correct that issue, which is reframing. Are people actually holding their phone the same way? Things like that can come really handy when you're trying to close that data gap.
Yeah, I mean, Adam had to put up with at least a year, possibly two, of me being really frustrated about smartwatches because they're just massively too big for my wrists. And, that was a genuine problem. But I'm also frustrated that I can't add to an exercise when I'm out and about, when my child was a baby and I was pushing around sort of 20 kilos in a buggy.
Yeah.
I'd be like, this is extra exercise, guys. You push around an extra like half your body weight and we'll see how well you do.
Exactly. It's so interesting that you bring it up that way because, again, like I was saying earlier, it isn't usually malicious, but it just wouldn't be in the mind of someone designing it had they not gone through that experience. And that's why it's so important to have a kind of a diverse set of minds thinking about this from the very, very beginning.
So obviously the best way to correct data imbalance is to account for those kind of variables at the planning stage. But what do you do if you've already got a data set that you suspect is biased in some way? Is there any way to correct for that after the data has been collected and processed, or is it just a case of effectively starting from scratch with your data collection and your processes?
That's a really fair point because ultimately with technology, you don't want to take a step back. You want to move forward and you want to continue to build on things that do exist. There are many decision traps. We could talk about confirmation bias, framing, emotions, but I think availability bias, in my opinion, is particularly dangerous in this context, but also important to identify to actually address this, just like you're saying. So sometimes getting the right data is much harder, but it doesn't make it less right. So it's important to know. That's all you have to do. You need to know if the data that you're using has limitations and what those limitations are, because that will carry over. And perhaps it won't be meaningful to answering the question that you had at hand. It's really important that you don't confuse the data with the actual questions. These are two separate things. So this doesn't mean that we stop all activity until data sets are clean and updated and improved. It's just that we acknowledge the limitations and work towards getting better data sets. Say, for example, because even when we do have the information, let's use an example that might be a bit grim, but there is a lot of information about the pill, and that is very, very obviously around women, and the conclusions that have been drawn from the data are actually quite scary at times. And even then, that's having the data. Like, imagine how dangerous it is to not have it. So that's something to bear in mind. And I'm not trying to kind of push the feminist agenda. We can if you want to, but my point is this can be taken just as an objective issue around lacking important information to get to a conclusion and to feed into the scientific process. One of the reasons why I love working with technology is that it's evolving and it's improving. And this means that a lot of things that would have seemed impossible before are now a reality. So, for example, processing power has changed loads, which has really changed the way that AI can actually be applied and used.
Yeah, it's interesting that you speak about the pill, for example, because another problem with unbalanced data sets, as I understand it, is satisfied customers rarely kind of give any input. That's why you get people who are having problems, people who are dissatisfied, and that can skew data sets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's particularly true when you're using AI for marketing or customer service, like you're saying. This is really important information, though, because if things are going smoothly, you won't hear back. So it is a little bit like getting corrections for an essay when you're, a student or what have you. Like it's actually important to get the corrections adjusted. That's also how AI works. So, machine learning looks to improve the connections that led to bad recommendations. Getting information about when something went wrong is how you fix it. A recommendation on Netflix, if it wasn't right, you can identify that, and then that recommendation engine will be improved with negative feedback. So it isn't terrible when it comes to data to only get those data points, because it just basically means there's a problem here. Look out for it.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about data and how we can fix the data gap for another couple of hours, but unfortunately that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you once again, Connie, COO of BioBeats, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can sign up to receive our daily newsletter, bringing all the latest news and insight from the world of tech directly to your inbox. Why not also register to receive our monthly virtual magazine, ITPro 2020, which brings you all the best content from the past month, as well as several exclusive features.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and review, which will help your fellow IT professionals find us more easily.
And finally, remember to sign up for your free ticket to ITPro Live. We'll be back next week for more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.
There's a reason flash storage is called flash storage and not electronic non-volatile computer memory storage. From quick and efficient data retrieval to instant scalability, everything about IBM flash storage is fast. It's also cloud-ready and surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price of 2,200 kroner for 24 terabytes of all flash. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.